Chained in the dark market, she cried out for hope, and a human was the one who answered.
The Zyrex Bazaar stank of burning metal, unwashed bodies, and something fouler beneath it all, desperation. The entire market sprawled like an infected wound across the underbelly of the asteroid, a pulsating mass of crime, barter, and suffering. Here, morality held no weight. Only credits did. Jack Voss moved through the throng like a shadow, boots firm on the uneven steel plating, his long coat brushing against his holster with every step. His face was unremarkable, his stance relaxed, but beneath the calm exterior lay a predator's awareness. Jack Voss was not a hero. He had been a soldier once, a pilot for the Orion Free Legion, a man who followed orders and fought for causes that in the end meant nothing. The war ended. The victors rewrote history, and Jack was left with nothing but scars and a rusting starship. Now, he was just another drifter, a smuggler when it paid well, a courier when it was safe, a thief when he was desperate. The Zyrex Bazaar was supposed to be a quick stop. A few spare parts, maybe a drink, then back into the void where no one gave a damn about the past. Then he heard the girl scream. It wasn't a loud scream, nor one of hysteria. It was short, clipped, a cry choked down before it could fully escape. Jack should have kept walking. Instead, his eyes found the auction platform. She was chained there like cargo, wrists bound above her head, ankles locked in iron loops bolted to the rusted metal. Blue skin, deep as an ocean trench. Green hair long and tangled. The overhead lights painted her in sickly yellow, but even in the dimness, her golden eyes burned. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't sobbing. She was watching. Not at the crowd. Not at her captors. At him. Jack exhaled slowly. He wasn't here for this. He wasn't here to... now here's a sight. The voice was wet, slithering, too familiar. Jack's fingers twitched as he turned. The bug-eyed bastard running the auction was Calrisk, a mid-tier slaver with delusions of grandeur. His translucent frills fluttered in delight, mandibles spreading in a grotesque imitation of a grin. "You're a long way from the core, Voss," Calrisk purred, all 8 of his glossy black eyes reflecting the dim market lights. "Last I heard, you were running contraband for that miserable drunk on Callisto." He let out a clicking laugh. "Didn't take you for the sentimental type." Jack forced a smirk. "I've got a soft spot for overgrown roaches." Calrisk's amusement didn't waver. "Oh, I remember now. You've always had a habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." He gestured toward the girl, clawed fingers flexing. "Interested, are we? Well, good news, Captain Voss." His voice dripped mockery. "I'm feeling generous today." Jack's stomach tightened. His name was out. The nearby bidders, corporate buyers, well-dressed smugglers, a handful of mercs, all turned. He could feel them measuring him now, reassessing. Jack didn't flinch. He just nodded toward the girl. "How much?" Calrisk's mandibles clicked. "Oh, this one?" He trailed his claws along her shoulder, slow and deliberate. "A rare find. A species wiped from the stars. And yet here she is still breathing. Quite the miracle." Jack saw the flicker in the girl's expression. "A lie," Calrisk continued. "A pet, a trophy, a prize. However you wish to use her, she won't break easily." His claws grazed her arm, his frills twitching in amusement. "But you look like the kind of man who likes a challenge." Something inside Jack snapped. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just moved. His fist collided with Calrisk's face, snapping mandibles and sending the slaver staggering back, shrieking in shock. The gathered crowd gasped as violet ichor dripped from Calrisk's broken mouth. Jack didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol. 2 shots, clean, practiced. The first took out a guard's knee, sending him crumbling with a strangled yell. The second blew the rifle from another's grip before he could fire. Blaster fire erupted in return. Jack lunged forward, fingers gripping cold iron. The girl's shackles were old, rusted, weak from years of wear. He wrenched hard, the metal screaming before snapping apart. "Can you run?" She hesitated for half a second. Then she nodded. Jack grabbed her wrist, warm, electric alive, and pulled. The bazaar erupted. Shots burned past them as they tore through the winding stalls, shoving past startled vendors, and fleeing civilians. Sirens wailed, alarms blaring. The slaver market was on full lockdown now. They ducked into a shadowed alley, metal walls slick with condensation. Jack's heart pounded against his ribs as he risked a glance back. Too many. Too fast. The girl was watching him. Up close, she was smaller than she seemed on that platform. Lean muscle, no wasted movement, not just a captive. A fighter. Yet she wasn't breathing hard. "Who the hell are you?" she murmured. "Jack." He wiped blood from his knuckles, still tasting the adrenaline. A pause. "Why?" Jack exhaled through his teeth. He didn't have a good answer. Felt like the thing to do. She stared at him, unreadable. Then, to his complete and utter disbelief, she huffed a quiet laugh. "You're a madman," she muttered. Jack grinned. "So I've been told." The comms unit on a fallen merc crackled. "Boss, we know it's you, and you know what happens next." Jack went still. Cowrisk's voice slithered through the channel, thick with malice. "Run, little human. Run fast, because Zyrex doesn't forgive. And neither does Varlo Krex." Jack clenched his jaw. Varlo Krex. The name landed like a stone in his gut. The girl tilted her head, eyes sharp. "Trouble?" Jack reloaded his blaster. "Only if they catch us." And then they ran. Jack Voss had been in worse situations. Probably. Adrenaline pounded through his veins as he dragged the alien woman through the steaming underbelly of Zyrex Bazaar, dodging falling debris and leaping over scattered crates. The whole market was in uproar, alarms shrieking in furious pulses. Varlo Krex's men would be hunting them now. Jack had stolen from the wrong people before, but this was a whole new level of suicidal. The woman kept pace, her bare feet light against the metal ground. She wasn't slowing him down. If anything, she was matching his speed. Her golden eyes scanned every alley, every exit. Not just a captive, an escape artist. "Left," she called, her voice sharp over the chaos. Jack didn't question her. He pivoted, yanking her down a dimly lit side passage. The stench of rust and decay hung thick in the air. Behind them, heavy boots thundered. "You know a way out?" he asked between breaths. "Yes," she shot back. Then, after a beat, "Maybe." Jack grunted. Comforting. A red warning light flickered along the alley walls, illuminating the detainment barriers ahead. Thick, reinforced plating designed to cut off sectors in case of riot or attack. Jack skidded to a halt. "Shit." The woman's gaze darted to a narrow ventilation shaft high above. "There." Jack followed her stare, already calculating. The opening was small, too small for him, but just enough for her. "You fit?" he asked. "Yes." He was already kneeling, lacing his fingers together. "Go." She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then she planted a foot in his hands, and he launched her upward. She caught the edge of the shaft, muscles straining as she pulled herself inside. The second she disappeared, Jack spun toward the oncoming guards. They were close. Too close. Jack didn't have time to fight. Instead, he grabbed the nearest crate and hurled it at the control panel beside the barrier doors. Sparks erupted. A siren blared. And then, the security gates slammed shut, trapping the mercenaries on the other side. Jack exhaled, rolling his shoulders as the guards pounded against the metal. "Buys us a minute," he muttered. Then he turned back to the shaft. "Tell me there's an exit." A rusted panel above ripped free, clattering to the floor beside him. She crouched inside the vent, reaching down. "Climb." Jack arched a brow. "You're stronger than you look." Her expression didn't change. "You're heavier than you look." Jack smirked and grabbed her arm. Her grip was strong, warm, steady. She pulled, and he swung himself up with a grunt, squeezing into the tight passage. For the first time since the fight began, there was silence. Jack exhaled, pressing his back against the cool metal. The woman sat across from him, knees tucked under her chin. Close. Too close. The space was barely wide enough for them both. Up close, she looked different. The tension was still in her shoulders, the wary alertness in her gaze. But now, under the dim, emergency glow, he saw the exhaustion behind the fire. The bruises along her wrists. the faint tremble in her fingers. Jack rested his head back. You got a name? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, Eudora. Jack nodded. All right, Eudora. Where exactly are we going? There's a smuggler's exit through the lower tunnels, she said. It connects to an old docking bay. If we get there before they lock it down, we steal a ship. Jack grinned. I like the way you think. Her expression remained unreadable. I didn't say steal. Jack chuckled. You didn't have to. A beat of silence. Then her gaze flickered. You didn't have to help me. Jack rolled his shoulders. Didn't like the way that bastard looked at you. Eudora studied him. You don't know me? No, Jack admitted. But I know a cage when I see one. Her golden eyes met his. For the first time, something in her expression softened. Jack shifted, his boot knocking against hers in the cramped space. So he said, You really the last of your kind? Eudora hesitated. Then, very quietly, No. Jack raised a brow. Her gaze drifted downward. But I might be the last one left free. Something dark twisted in Jack's gut. He didn't ask what happened. Didn't need to. He'd seen the aftermath of war before. He just reached for his blaster and checked the charge. Then let's keep it that way. Eudora exhaled. And for the first time since they met, she nodded. Jack had always trusted his instincts. They kept him alive in wars, bar fights, and smuggling runs gone bad. But now, sitting in a rusted ventilation shaft with a half-feral alien woman, he felt them wavering. She was too composed for someone freshly freed from a cage. Most people in her position would be shaking, struggling to breathe through the panic, asking what now. But Eudora sat perfectly still, golden eyes flicking between shadows, ears attuned to every distant footstep below. Jack wasn't sure which was more unsettling, the way she carried herself or the fact that he was starting to trust her. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on his blaster. Below them, the market raged, slavers barking orders over crackling intercoms, heavy boots slamming against metal as patrols combed through alleyways. The bounty on his head had tripled by now. Krex wouldn't let this go. Eudora shifted beside him. The narrow space forced them close, too close. Jack caught a faint scent, not sweat or grime, but something subtly floral, electric, like charged air before a storm. She turned to face him. We should move. Jack didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked to her wrists, where the shackles had been. The skin was raw, but healed too quickly. How do you know the way? He asked finally. Back in the market, you called every turn before I did. Eudora hesitated. Jack narrowed his eyes. You've done this before. She exhaled, tilting her head toward the cramped tunnel ahead. You want to get out of here, or trade questions? Jack's lips curled. Why not both? Eudora didn't respond immediately. Then she shifted, the movement so slight he barely noticed, but something changed in her posture. A flicker of tension, something guarded. I tried to escape once, she admitted. Didn't make it. Jack studied her. He waited for more. Instead, she turned away. He could have let it go. Should have. But something about her words didn't sit right. Tried to escape. Not got caught. Not was recaptured. Tried. Jack's fingers tapped against his blaster. What happened? Eudora's shoulders tensed, but she kept her voice even. Someone sold me out. The slavers knew before I even made it to the docks. Jack frowned. Who? Silence. Not a refusal. Exactly. More like she didn't have the answer herself. He watched the way her hands clenched, how her breath hitched for just a second before she steadied it. She wasn't afraid of being caught again. She was afraid of not knowing who betrayed her. Jack let the thought settle. Then he nodded toward the vent ahead. Tunnel leads where? Eudora took the shift in conversation for what it was, a mercy. Maintenance level. Smuggler's corridor runs beneath it. From there, we can reach the docks. Jack smirked. We. She met his gaze without flinching. You saved me. Now I'm saving you. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. Hell of a trade. Before she could respond, a metallic clang echoed behind them. Jack's body moved before his mind caught up. He grabbed Eudora's wrist, pulling her down just as a section of the vent exploded inward. Shards of metal rained, smoke curling into the narrow passage. A heavy boot slammed through the wreckage, and then a mercenary dropped into the shaft. Jack fired first. The shot tore through the guard's armor, sending him crashing backward into the torn metal. Another dropped in right after him, but Eudora was already moving. She ducked, spinning low, grabbing the fallen guard's weapon before he hit the floor. In one fluid motion, she swung up, bringing the butt of the rifle straight into the second man's jaw. Bone cracked. He collapsed. Jack raised an eyebrow. Not bad. Eudora tossed the rifle aside like it was useless junk. Move! Jack didn't argue. They slid deeper into the vents, moving fast. Behind them, more voices shouted orders. The slavers had pinned down their location. Jack clenched his jaw. They needed an exit fast. Eudora reached a rusted hatch at the end of the shaft. She ran her fingers along the frame, then, without hesitation, pressed her palm against a small panel. The lock released with a hiss. Jack stiffened. That's not standard tech. Eudora didn't look at him as she pulled the door open. I know. Jack frowned. She was hiding something, but right now they didn't have time for secrets. He dropped down first, landing in a darkened corridor lined with abandoned power cells. The air was thick with the scent of oil and something burnt. Eudora landed beside him. The moment her feet touched the ground, she went still. Jack noticed it immediately. What? She turned, gaze flicking toward a broken security panel at the far end of the hall. Her fingers twitched. Something's wrong, she murmured. Jack followed her line of sight. To him, it was just another abandoned corridor. But Eudora saw something he didn't. Jack's grip tightened on his blaster. Eudora. Then he heard it. A single footstep. Not from behind him. Not from the vents. From ahead. Jack barely had time to react before the shadows moved. A figure stepped forward, armor reflecting the dim emergency lights. Tall, broad, a long rifle slung lazily over one shoulder. The face beneath the helmet grinned with slow amusement. Well, the man drawled. Jack Voss. Jack's stomach dropped. He knew that voice. Eudora's muscles tensed. Jack could feel it even standing beside her. The man stepped closer, boots echoing on the grated floor. You really don't know how to stay dead, do you? Jack exhaled through his nose. His blaster was already aimed, but something in his gut told him it wouldn't be that easy. Eudora's whisper barely reached him. Who is he? Jack's jaw tightened. An old problem. Jack Voss had made plenty of mistakes in his life. But this one stared him in the face with a crooked grin and a rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. The man blocking their path was tall, broad, and too damn comfortable. His dark armor, worn at the edges but well-maintained, bore no insignia, no loyalty. A mercenary, then? Or worse, a freelancer who owed debts only to his own survival. Jack's grip on his blaster tightened. Had a feeling I'd see you again. The man tilted his head, amusement flickering in sharp gray eyes. Come on, Voss. You didn't think I'd let you have all the fun. Eudora was still as stone beside him, but Jack felt her focus shift, analyzing the situation. She wasn't the type to waste words. Smart. Jack kept his blaster level. Didn't expect to find you in a hellhole like this, Taryn. Taryn Graves, smuggler, enforcer, professional bastard. A man Jack once called an ally, before betrayal turned that word to ash. Taryn sighed, shaking his head. Disappointed? Thought we were friends. Jack smirked. Friends don't try to kill each other for a paycheck. Taryn clicked his tongue. That was years ago, and technically you lived, because I shot first. Taryn chuckled. Details. Jack flicked his gaze down the hall. 2 exits. One blocked by Taryn, the other leading into a dead zone of collapsed corridors. Trapped. Eudora shifted beside him, barely perceptible, but Jack caught it. She was ready to move. Good. Taryn finally glanced at her, his smirk widening. Now, this is interesting. I was expecting you to be running with a crew, Voss. But instead, I find you playing hero. He eyed Eudora with open curiosity. Slavers are real pissed about this one. Big bounty. Makes me wonder what's so special about her. Eudora's voice was flat. You don't want to know. Taryn grinned. Oh, but I do. Jack stepped slightly in front of her. Not gonna happen. Taryn sighed, mock disappointment in his tone. Shame. But business is business, Jack. And Varlo Crex pays well. He lifted his rifle, slow and deliberate. So why don't you make this easy? Jack fired first. Taryn dodged. Fast. Too fast. The shot scorched past his shoulder, hitting the wall behind him. In an instant, Taryn moved, fluid, predatory. His rifle snapped up. Jack twisted aside, just as the blast sizzled past his ribs. Eudora was already moving. She ducked under Jack's arm, a flash of blue and green, her movements seamless. Before Taryn could react, she was inside his guard, close enough to strike. She didn't hesitate. Her elbow slammed into his throat. Taryn stumbled back, coughing, but he recovered fast, too fast. He swung the butt of his rifle. Eudora dodged, but not completely. The edge of the impact clipped her shoulder, sending her skidding back. Jack fired again, forcing Taryn to retreat a step. Still quick, Taryn muttered, rubbing his throat. I'll give you that. Jack flashed a humorless grin. Still an asshole, Taryn aimed again. But before he could fire, Eudora grabbed a fallen pipe from the ground. She threw it, not at Taryn, at the flickering overhead lights. The corridor plunged into darkness. Jack moved. He heard Taryn curse, the shifting of boots against metal. Jack lunged sideways, silent, calculating. A breath, a heartbeat, a target. Jack swung. His fist connected with Taryn's jaw, sending him stumbling. A moment of vulnerability. That was all they needed. Eudora's hand found Jack's in the dark. Move! They ran. They emerged into a cold, rusting corridor, the flickering emergency lights barely holding against the failing power grid. Jack inhaled sharply, ribs aching from the close-range firefight. He won't stay down long. Eudora's posture was tense, her injured shoulder stiff. But her eyes were sharp, focused. Jack gestured toward the far end of the passage. You said the smuggler's route is close? Eudora nodded. 2 more levels down. Jack nodded, pushing forward. Then let's go. She hesitated. Just a flicker. Jack noticed. He slowed, turning to face her fully. What? Eudora studied him. Then, finally, who was he? Jack exhaled through his nose. Old problem. Eudora didn't look away. The kind that comes back. Jack's jaw tightened. Always. A moment passed. Then she simply nodded. Jack huffed a quiet laugh. You're not going to ask what happened? Eudora started walking. Would you tell me? Jack smirked. No. Then I won't ask. He chuckled, falling in a step beside her. But beneath the humor, something coiled tight in Jack's gut. Taryn wasn't the kind to let things go. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jack Voss had spent most of his life walking the fine line between stupid and reckless. Right now, he was tipping dangerously toward the latter. They sprinted down the dim corridor, their boots slamming against rusted metal. The stale air carried the scent of burning wires and ozone, the market's power grid failing under the chaos. It wouldn't be long before the slavers flooded the tunnels, locking the whole sector down. Jack risked a glance at Eudora. She was keeping pace, but her expression had shifted. Something sat behind her golden eyes now. Something not quite fear, not quite relief. They weren't free yet. Jack slowed as they neared a junction. The tunnel split ahead, one path sloping downward, the other curving into darkness. Eudora stopped beside him, breath steady despite the run. The lower passage leads to the docks, she said. If we... A gunshot rang out. Jack yanked her back, pressing both of them against the nearest wall as a plasma bolt sizzled through the air, striking the metal just inches from where they had stood. Shit. He turned sharply, his blaster already raised. 2 mercenaries stood at the far end of the corridor, weapons hot, faces obscured by tactical helmets. Jack fired first. One shot took out the first guard's knee. The second clipped the other's shoulder. They staggered, cursing. Before they could recover, Eudora was already moving. She didn't go for her own weapon. Instead, she kicked off the wall, propelling herself forward in a blur of motion. The second merc barely had time to react before she slammed into him, one hand gripping his wrist, the other twisting his rifle from his grasp with a brutal efficiency Jack hadn't expected. The first guard, still writhing on the ground, reached for his radio. Jack didn't let him. A sharp kick to the head sent the man sprawling into unconsciousness. Eudora exhaled, tossing the stolen rifle aside. "They'll send more." Jack nodded. "We need to move." But just as they turned toward the exit, a voice crackled through the fallen guard's radio. "Taryn." "Jack." Jack stiffened. The smooth drawl carried through the static, amused, taunting. "I know where you're going," Taryn continued. "You really thought I wouldn't? The smuggler's corridor? The same damn route you used 5 years ago." Jack's jaw clenched. "You're predictable," Taryn mused. "And that's what's going to get you killed." The transmission cut. A heavy silence settled between them. Eudora spoke first. "He's waiting." Jack exhaled sharply. Yeah, of course Taryn would know. Jack had used the same damn route once before, back when he'd been running weapons for a syndicate that no longer existed. It was a reliable smuggler's path, one that bypassed most security checkpoints. But if Taryn had already set up an ambush, Eudora studied his face. "You still want to go that way?" Jack hesitated. The smart move would be turning back, finding another way. But that would cost them time they didn't have. Jack checked his blaster's charge. "We don't have a choice." Eudora held his gaze a second longer, then nodded. "Then let's make sure we don't walk in blind." Jack smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." They moved fast, slipping deeper into the tunnels. The passageway sloped downward, the air growing colder. Flickering emergency lights painted the walls in broken flashes of red and gold. Jack felt it before he saw it. A change in the air. The quiet weight of a trap waiting to spring. They reached the final corridor. Ahead, the docking bay doors loomed, their way out. But standing between them and freedom? Taryn, and at least 6 mercs. Jack stopped short. His pulse remained steady, but his mind raced, analyzing the angles, the odds. Not great. Taryn, leaning against a crate, greeted him with a slow grin. "Took your time." Jack sighed. "Not in the mood, Taryn." Taryn gestured to the mercs. "Neither are they." Eudora shifted slightly, weight-centered. "Ready." Jack noted it, but kept his blaster low, not firing yet. Taryn tilted his head toward Eudora. "Still don't see what makes her worth all this trouble." Eudora's expression remained unreadable. "You wouldn't." Jack cut in. "We walking away from this? Or are you going to make it messy?" Taryn considered him. "Tell you what, give me the girl, and you can leave." Jack laughed once. "Not happening." Taryn sighed, like he'd expected that answer. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blinking device. Jack's stomach dropped. A tracker. Taryn twirled it between his fingers. "You thought I wouldn't tag you back in the tunnels?" His smirk widened. "Krex's men are already on their way." Eudora's jaw tightened. Jack's mind raced. They were running out of time. Then, Eudora moved. Jack barely saw it. A flash of blue and green. Then Taryn's arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The tracker hit the floor. Taryn staggered back, cursing, but Eudora didn't stop. She grabbed his collar, slammed him into the nearest crate, and for the first time, Jack saw something in her eyes that wasn't just calculation. It was cold, final, enfrose. For the first time, Jack saw him afraid. Eudora's voice was quiet. "Steady. You talk too much." Jack didn't hear the rest, because that's when the explosion started. The docking bay erupted in chaos. Jack pulled Eudora back, just as plasma fire rained down from the far side of the room. Krex's men, arriving fast. No more running. Jack fired first, dropping 2 mercs in quick succession. Eudora spun low, grabbing a fallen weapon and returning fire with deadly precision. Taryn, still dazed, scrambled backward, shouting orders, but his men were already falling. Jack grabbed Eudora's wrist. "Ship, now!" They sprinted toward the nearest freighter. Jack's stolen codes worked barely. The hatch hissed open, the cockpit lights flickering as the system booted up. Eudora dropped into the co-pilot's seat, her fingers flying over the controls. "Engines online." Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the throttle, punched the power, and tore them free from the docking bay. The ship shuddered as it broke through Xyrex's atmosphere, alarms blaring in protest. Jack exhaled. His hands still gripped the controls, knuckles white. Eudora sat back, watching him. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't have to stay." Jack smirked. "Yeah, well, guess I'm getting sentimental." A long pause. Then, for the first time, Eudora smiled. Jack had always been good at getting away. He'd escaped war zones, bounty hunters, and the occasional bad debt. Slipping past Xyrex's slaver should have been just another job. But this time, he wasn't alone. The stolen freighter trembled as it broke free of the planet's gravity, engines groaning under the strain. Jack kept his hands steady on the controls, eyes locked on the viewport. Beyond the thinning atmosphere, space stretched wide and waiting. The docking bay alarms had long faded, replaced by the familiar hum of a ship pushing against the void. Silence settled in the cockpit, thick with everything left unsaid. Eudora sat beside him, her fingers poised over the navigation panel. She was still too still, not in the way someone relaxed, but in the way someone was bracing for the next fight. Jack knew that feeling well. He adjusted a few core settings, then leaned back. "Well," he muttered, "that was a disaster." Eudora didn't respond at first. Then, finally, "We survived." Jack glanced at her. For now, he studied her profile, noting how the soft glow of the console illuminated her features. There was no relief in her expression, no sense of victory. He should have left it alone, but he never did know when to keep his mouth shut. "You all right?" A flicker of hesitation, then a nod. "Yes." Jack didn't believe her, but he let it slide. For now, the ship drifted in the quiet. Jack had locked in a temporary course, not a destination, just movement. They weren't being chased. Yet, Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "We'll need to ditch this ship. Crex isn't going to let it slide that easy." Eudora was silent for a beat too long. Then she said, "There's a station near the outer rim. No corporate oversight. Unregistered traffic." Jack's brow lifted. "You know it?" She hesitated. "I've been there before." There it was again, that careful, calculated vagueness. Jack wasn't sure if it was because she didn't trust him or because she wasn't ready to trust herself. He pulled up the coordinates. The station floated in orbit around the shattered remains of a long-dead planet, a skeleton of rust and forgotten things. Jack tapped his fingers against the console. "All right, we'll head there." Eudora simply nodded. But Jack felt it now, a shift in the air. They weren't just running anymore. She was going toward something. The hum of the ship wrapped around them, steady and constant. Jack had always liked this part of spaceflight, the limbo between destinations, the moment where nothing had caught up yet. But the silence between them had weight. Jack leaned back in his chair, arms folded behind his head. "So," he said, "you gonna tell me what makes you so special?" Eudora didn't look at him. "What makes you think I am?" Jack gave a short laugh. "Slavers don't send entire hunting parties after one prisoner, unless they're sitting on something worth a hell of a lot of credits." Her fingers trailed absently along the edge of the control panel. "You shouldn't have stayed." Jack smirked. "You shouldn't have let me." That finally made her smile. It was small, barely there, but real. Jack exhaled, tilting his head to look at her. "Seriously, though, why the hell is Crex so obsessed with you?" She was quiet. Then, at last, she lifted her hand and pulled back her sleeve. Jack's breath stalled. Beneath the fabric, embedded just above her wrist, was a brand. Not ink, not scar tissue, something metallic. It pulsed faintly beneath her skin, like circuitry woven into flesh. Jack sat up. "That's a tracking implant," she said. "And something else." Jack's mind worked fast. He had seen implants before, security tags, control devices for slaves. But this was different. Jack frowned. "Something else like what?" Eudora's gaze didn't waver. "A key." Jack stared at her. "A key to what?" Her fingers curled into a fist. "I don't know." Jack swore under his breath. Of course it couldn't just be simple. And for the first time, he saw it. A crack in Eudora's composure. Not fear. Something sharper. She wasn't scared of the implant itself. She was scared of what would happen if it did what it was meant to. Jack leaned back, running a hand through his hair. So let me get this straight. You don't know what it unlocks. You don't know why Crex wants it. And you have no idea why it's inside you. Eudora's voice was quiet. Yes. Jack let out a sharp breath. Fantastic. The station loomed ahead, a fractured web of forgotten metal, blinking in the darkness. Jack docked with practiced ease, despite his mind still racing with everything he'd just learned. They stepped onto the station's deck. The stale air was thick with the scent of oil, rust, and too many bodies in one place. It was loud, buzzing with voices and neon lights, a place for ghosts and people who didn't want to be found. Eudora moved beside him, her posture still measured, but Jack could feel the shift. She wasn't bracing for a fight. She was searching. Jack rolled his shoulders, already scanning the crowd. All right, what now? Eudora didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, we find someone who can tell us what this thing is. Jack smirked. Just like that. Her lips twitched. Unless you'd rather leave. Jack didn't, and they both knew it. He sighed. Guess we're in this together, then? Eudora tilted her head, something unreadable flickering in her golden eyes. Then softly, guess we are. Jack huffed a quiet laugh. All right, let's raise some hell. And with that, they disappeared into the neon-lit haze of the station, stepping further into a mystery neither of them were ready for.